So this paper is co-authored with Rex Baker, my colleague of many years, retired from Cal Poly-Pomona, and Rex is down here in the front. Would you hold your hand up? We're going to ask you to help me field questions when we get to that later this morning. I would really like to talk about the database that Rex and I have maintained on human safety issues with coyotes over the last several decades. But I think it might be appropriate this morning to start with something of an overview of the history of what's happened not only in Southern California but elsewhere. Because by the 1970s, we started seeing coyotes do things that we had not seen them do before in Southern California. They started showing up kind of fearlessly in places where they hadn't been seen, seemed to ignore people, seemed to be exploring suburbia, and we knew they were adaptable, but we didn't know they were quite that adaptable. And so it became of interest to a lot of us who had been interested in coyotes over the years to try to figure out what was going on. But there were some earlier reports that might have given a hint of that. For example, a report in Young and Jackson's seminal book on coyotes called The Clever Coyote, published in 1951, related a 1947 report from Yellowstone where there were tourist habituated coyotes, no doubt getting handouts and food from tourists, causing traffic jams along the main highway, and they said that was until now unheard of in Yellowstone's long and colorful history. So just a hint of what might have been to come. The photographer and naturalist Hope Ryden, in her book God's Dog, published in 1975, told about an incident that she had personally experienced in 1973, again in Yellowstone. She saw some of these coyotes begging for food from cars. She got out of her own car to photograph the coyote, left the door open, the coyote got in the car, and she couldn't get the thing out again. It just simply refused to budge. And she said, this is an accident waiting to happen. Somebody at some point is going to get bit. Well, let's move to Southern California again. Some of you who have seen or know the habitats here know that there's a lot of food in residential areas, and out in the drier scrubland or wildland that might be adjacent to a lot of suburbs or a lot of these mansions that are up in the hills. It's pretty hard for coyotes to make a living, especially during the dry half of the year in this Mediterranean climate. So all of a sudden they have ample food, water, and shelter that they didn't have before, and then no enemies in the Los Angeles basin anymore, per se. And so coyote behavior adapted to that. And coyotes became more obvious not only in the evening and early morning hours, but sometimes in the middle of the day, and started to raise questions about what was going on. Robert Froman, in his 1961 book, speculated about why coyotes had never shown any interest in eating people, don't have any taste for human flesh. He talked about them being curious, but he said he was unable to find any record or even an unsubstantiated report of a coyote ever in Los Angeles ever having attacked a person. We heard about Disney yesterday. Scott Hingstrom maligned some of the Disney attitudes toward wildlife. In this case, maybe Disney was a little bit of a prophet. We didn't realize it at the time. Country Coyote Goes to Hollywood, 1961. Little did he know, probably, that the coyote would, in fact, have gone to Hollywood on its own. So in 1982, a paper in the Vertebrate Pest Conference by Robert Howell, Deputy Ag Commissioner for Los Angeles County, he reported at least 6 persons had been attacked by coyotes in LA County during the past 3 years. One of those was a fatality on a 3-year-old child. Kelly Keene of Glendale was killed in her own yard by a coyote that attacked her. Wall Street Journal article about 2 months later, headlines are, Child's Killing Stirs Anti-Coyote Uproar in Los Angeles Area. Other people, pets attacked. Reaction called hysterical by wildlife organizations. Well, there's a lot of food in suburbia. There's pet food, there's household refuse, there's landscape fruits and seeds, there's compost piles, there's rabbits and rodents and cats and all kinds of other stuff that make life really easy for coyotes in a lot of suburban areas. And it turns out that's probably not only true of Southern California, but a lot of other suburban areas. And in fact, a study by a doctoral student at UCLA in 1988 found that in comparison to the normal home range size for coyotes on, say, a natural habitat or a California sheep ranch, in suburban Southern California, the home range size of a coyote might have been as small as 1/4 of a square mile, something we'd not seen before. And then in the Wildlife Society Bulletin in 1989, Lou Carbon, Canadian wildlife biologist, published an account of attacks by coyotes on children, primarily in national parks in Canada. This is the first time I think this kind of thing reached what would be essentially the mainstream wildlife literature. And he actually inferred that some of those attacks were predatory in nature. In fact, I think he was quite certain about that. Not all of them, but at least some of them, the coyotes were regarding children as potential prey. And Rex Baker and I got to talking about this, and Rex actually drew me into this back in the 90s and said, you know, that we need to have more of this in the literature. And by 1998, there had been, as far as we could document in our data, at least 53 attacks on people in California, resulting in 21 injuries. So that was in the 18th VPC proceedings. And most of those attacks were in Southern California, particularly in Los Angeles, Orange, and San Diego counties. We're kind of in the epicenter of it right here. And a little bit in the western or suburban edges of San Bernardino and Riverside County. And so we started looking at the data, and here's a data set from 2004 showing the progression of coyote attacks on people that we could define starting in the late 70s and going up till that time. And you can see it looks like a growing trend. Well, the data is hard to come by, and Rex, in looking at what was available in the news media or talking to people he knew in agencies, discovered there was stuff that wasn't in the database. And there were also people that said, oh yeah, we know about those, but there are no records, or our agency had records, but we throw them out every 5 years. And this was not in an age where you could electronically search out a lot of stuff in the earlier years. So there's probably a lot of data missing. But still, I think there's probably an upward trend in attacks that started to happen in Southern California during that period of time. Well, why did that happen? Well, we started speculating about that. There's a growing, expanding human population in Southern California. Coyotes have been expanding their ranges and probably increasing their population in many areas. So there was greater opportunity for humans and coyotes to come into contact with each other, and that resulted partly from habituation, the behavioral change that made coyotes comfortable in that situation, but also human behavioral changes, because people became very tolerant of, curious about coyotes, wanted to see wildlife in their neighborhood. Some people were intentionally feeding them, no doubt. So by 1998, Rex, in his own ability to work some of these problems and being involved in some of the earlier incidents, started looking at coyote patterns of behavior. And the question was, can we predict when there's a clear and present danger to people from having coyotes in the neighborhood? Probably not very precisely, but can we at least predict when there might be an increased risk? And how might we define that? So he came up with a series of steps, 1 through 7, and here they are. And first, an increase in coyotes on streets and yards at night. Secondly, it would progress to an increase in coyotes non-aggressively approaching adults and or taking pets at night. Third stage, coyotes on streets and in parks and yards in early morning and late afternoon. Fourth stage, coyotes chasing or taking pets in the daytime. Fifth stage, coyotes attacking and taking pets on leashes or near owners, chasing joggers, bicyclists, or other adults. Sixth stage, coyotes seen in and around children's play areas, school grounds, parks at midday, sometimes very intently observing children at a distance. And seventh, coyotes acting aggressively toward adults in midday. Now, of course, there's variations on that. Not every coyote's going to be predictable. If there's one rule about coyotes, it's probably that there aren't any rules about coyotes. You take that as kind of a generalized pattern and then begin to make use of that in terms of evaluating what's going on. Coyote chasing a jogger in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. That's probably stage 5. You can kind of get a good description of what goes on in some cases and kind of ballpark where it is. And so here in the Presidio in San Francisco, just within recent years, they closed the area to dogs because I think there was some territorial sort of defense going on from the coyotes that were there, taking exception to the fact that people were walking their dogs or jogging with their dogs, and became a safety issue for the dogs. And this is a legal issue as well. If you have a public use area that you're in charge of and you don't post what you know to be a potential danger to people, there is legal precedent here in Orange County that the agency or whoever is maintaining the property could get sued successfully. I think there was a mountain lion case a number of years ago that resulted in that judgment. Well, back to Disney again. The Coyotes Lament, 1961. Those of us who grew up in Southern California had attitudes toward wildlife that we discovered later on, perhaps, in life was not very realistic. Here's an adult coyote teaching its young how to avoid traps, apparently. That's what I think the picture shows. I haven't seen the video clip yet. But it's probably something I saw growing up and just don't remember it. I didn't know I was going to be a coyote biologist when I grew up. Well, there's a paradigm shift from that to this. Simi Valley, 3.5-year-old boy attacked on a front porch. One of 4 victims attacked within 1 hour in the same neighborhood. And here's a woman in Pomona, eastern Los Angeles County, who found a coyote coming into her yard to attack her poodle, and she beat it off with this axe handle, and so in doing so got scratched on the leg. And you say, well, you know, what's a minor scratch? But because of the potential for rabies in coyotes, and it's not a large problem on the West Coast as much as it might be in some places on the East Coast, the medical professionals are going to say, if you had broken skin and you were in contact with a coyote, you need to go through the rabies series. And unfortunately, the folks who do the rabies series don't have any record keeping that's any better than the rest of us, so we can't find out how many coyote bites were involved. They usually classify those as wild animal bites, and you can't sort that out later on from the records that are kept. And then we were criticized when we published the papers about, well, you've defined attack too broadly. You know, maybe a coyote just came within 10 feet of you and growled. That's not an attack. So we said, okay, we'll change our definition to be a little tighter. It's involving only instances of physical contact between a coyote and a person. Initiated by the coyote, right? Okay. Well, Laverne, California, 1999, a 27-year-old male was bitten on the lip after trying to pick up and kiss a coyote. What can we say? We live in Southern California. That was not in our data set, and it is not in our data set. But our question was, how incomplete is our data set? And I gave this kind of talk before a Wildlife Services conference, all the state Wildlife Services folks in California. I think it was along about 2002 or maybe 4, I don't remember exactly. And those guys were really quite interested in it, but one of the Wildlife Services employees came up to me afterward and said, well, do you know about the attacks that happened in this one national park? I didn't see those in your data set. And I said, no, tell me more. They said, well, it was never in the newspapers. In 1975 and 76, there were 11 incidents in this particular park. And in June and July of 2000, another 7, and in the same park, another 14 incidents of people being bitten in 2001 in the summer. And I said, well, that's interesting. That adds 32 additional incidents to the 85 we had, and made us really wonder about how many were really happening, because there's really no way to get a grasp on it. We don't have any good record keeping. A member of the committee representing California to the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies back in 2009 said, coyote attacks on people are now routine in California, even though sometimes the reports in the newspaper will say, this is a rare thing. We're not sure we've ever seen it happen before. You've probably read that in the paper a number of times. So by 2004, we knew of at least 16 states and 4 provinces where documented attacks happened as best as we could determine. 6 years later, that had grown to 24 states and 6 provinces of Canada. And today, we've added, I think, 2 or 3 more states and at least 1 other province. So it's a growing problem throughout North America, and so that raises a number of interesting questions as well. So through 2015, we had noted more than 60 incidents just in California where a child likely would have been more seriously injured or killed had not an adult been there to intervene and save the child from the attack, attempt to scare the coyote away, or grab the child and somehow make it, put it into a safe place. Griffith Park, LA, 1995, some of the instances that Rex was involved in actually doing management work. A child bitten on the thigh, multiple puncture wounds. South Lake Tahoe in the wintertime, a child who was in a snowsuit, very heavily bitten around the face and neck, protected on the rest of her body because of the heavy snowsuit, otherwise might have been more seriously injured. And then there's one more recently from Colorado Springs. These are attacks on children. By the end of 2015, we had about 165 confirmed coyote attacks from California. Again, it's an incomplete list, and we know that. About 3/4 of them having occurred in the last decade. Injuries reported in 78 of the 165 attacks. And about 17 to 20% seem to be associated with the presence of dogs. So it could have been a person injured because they let their dog out in the backyard, coyote grabbed it, they went out and tried to enter the melee and save the dog and got bitten. Or in some cases, they were defending a dog, or a coyote approached both of them, maybe because the dog was there, and turned on the person and bit the person. So it's sometimes hard to sort that out from news reports. You almost have to interview people to get the full story. And we just learned recently that since last summer in the city of LA, there have been at least 12 people bitten in the city, and at least 5 bitten in Irvine, and most of those have never made the news. And we're in a situation now in Southern California where it's not news anymore, so you really can't pick this up very accurately from just news reports. But here we think is as good a record as we have of what's going on both in California, that's the dark bars, and outside of California in the red bars. So you can see it's a growing trend. Again, there's data missing in some years. There's probably incidents none of us know about. But in the eastern states or some of the other states where it's not happening as frequently, it probably does make the news when it happens more rapidly. And of course, we have a lot better search capabilities today because of the internet and all the connections to all the news media. So totals, again, approximations, about 113 attacks in California, about 133 in the rest of the continent, and plus 49 in Canada. So around 300, and it seems to be growing in some places right now. And a little bit surprisingly, about 60% of the victims are adults, about 40%, and that's throughout North America as far as we can tell. That seems to have been rather steady and consistent over the years. Here's a 22-year-old man in Colorado who was actually walking to work before dawn one morning and was attacked by 3 coyotes, and you can see that he suffered quite a few injuries in trying to beat those coyotes off. So, you know, that's a little surprising, but I guess maybe more shocking than it is surprising, knowing what coyote behavior can be. And we looked at seasonality, and we said, well, is most of it happening at one season or another? And yes, it turns out there is a little bit more happening during the pup rearing season, so March through August, when perhaps coyotes have greater food demands or defending dens or defending their young, and perhaps a little less so in September through February, when there are reduced food demands and perhaps reduced territoriality in the species. So we have defined some management and education needs and done this as we've gone along, trying to kind of create some adaptive management guidelines that can be useful to people on a local level. And certainly reducing resources and habitat for coyote in suburbia is really important, particularly for homeowners to understand what's drawing them in and try to eliminate some of those things. Reducing dense landscape habitat that provides them a place to hide, because a lot of descriptions are, well, the coyote came out of the bushes and did this, or just came out of nowhere and did that. And excluding coyotes where that is possible, although they're pretty good at getting through and around and over fences. And then maintaining natural wariness, if it is natural, of humans, if that's possible to do in a coyote population. We need to inform the public about ways to discourage predators in the neighborhoods. We need to educate responsible agencies concerning appropriate prevention and control strategies, so that can be passed along to the local citizenry. We really need to centralize the data on attacks, and I know some states and some counties and some cities have started doing that. California is not doing a real good job on that yet, except locally in a few cases. And then we need to, Rex and I believe, and many of our colleagues do, need to remove bold and aggressive coyotes when necessary. And we're not talking about doing coyote extermination in the suburbs. That would be impossible, very logistically difficult. We're talking about taking a few individuals out when they become a human health and safety problem. Well, how can we restore that wariness toward humans? Rex and his colleagues discovered that trapping or snaring a few coyotes that were causing problems in a problem area would in fact change the behavior of the remaining coyotes. And sometimes it would change it so drastically that there would be no problems in that neighborhood or local area for months, if not maybe even years. And that's also been reported in other states that have tried that strategy, selectively removing a few coyotes that were causing problems, particularly the bold ones, if possible to get them. And so doing it by trapping or snaring or perhaps shooting works. The question is, can you haze them and reverse the behavior? And that is a more difficult question. Perhaps you can in the early stages. If you look at Rex's stages 1 through 3, when the coyotes have not totally habituated to human presence and have not become aggressive, that hazing might actually be of some effect, or it might buy time until you clean up the neighborhood to get some of those attractants out of the way. But here we are in California, where one of those tools was taken away by an initiative, and other states too have passed anti-trapping initiatives, Colorado among them. In 1998, the general public got to vote on this, and it was actually tailored more as an anti-fur trapping measure, but it had some anti-predator control language in it as well. So that limited a little bit of the ability of folks to actually do that selective removal. And those of us who went to school thinking we were going to be a biologist and work with animals for our life now realize that we should have taken more courses in sociology or political science, and we probably should have all minored in psychology as well, because we do have a situation that's difficult to deal with. I have brought a little bit of the literature that we've produced over the years. There's also a bibliography that gives you links to some of this that you can find online. But one of those is a UC extension publication which we've designed for the general public that came out in 2007 that gives suburban audiences some idea of what's going on with coyotes, what the options are, how to clean up the neighborhood to provide attractants, and what some of the things that people can do themselves, and just helping people understand in a factual way what the risk might be and how to protect themselves and their pets and so forth. Well, in recent years, coyotes start doing different things. I don't know how many of you have seen this before. In Arizona and Southern California, coyotes walking around on the top of block cinder walls. In residential neighborhoods, we've seen it in Southern California. This picture is from Arizona. I kind of think it's like a kid in a candy store. Those coyotes are up there saying, oh, I wonder if there's any poodles out today. Or, no, today I'd like a chihuahua. And that's what they're doing. They're searching out unguarded pets or pet food or rubbish piles or bird feeders that attract rabbits or whatever it is. They own the neighborhood in some places. Then in 2009, this report out of Nova Scotia. You may have seen the headline, October 28th, a 19-year-old woman killed in Cape Breton Highlands National Park in Nova Scotia. Taylor Mitchell, a songwriter who was on a singing tour of eastern Canada, stopped at that park and thought she would take a stroll on one of the trails. It was actually a fairly well-used public trail. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she met 2 or 3 coyotes on the trail. They attacked and severely injured her, actually fed on her. She was airlifted to a hospital and died the next day from trauma and blood loss. Shocking, but maybe not surprising given the information that we knew about coyotes. But those coyotes in Nova Scotia are what you might call the eastern coyote. Potentially have some wolf genetics mixed in with them. They're larger, they seem more pack-like. And in Cape Breton, their main prey, apparently, that they were dealing with at the time was adult or young juvenile moose. So we have coyotes that were used to taking down fairly large prey and doing so in a wolf sort of pack-like behavior, something that we have not fully appreciated until that incident. The politics of urban coyote management is probably going to be driven by pet attacks because of the number of them and the trauma associated with that. And the interesting thing to me is we have little or no data on that, on pet attacks. Here's a paper by Alexander and Quinn fairly recently that talks about Canadian print media reports of attacks on humans and pets. German Shepherd here in in Orange County that was injured a number of years ago by coyotes. It's not only small and medium-sized dogs, it's sometimes large dogs. Here, closer to home, just a few miles up the road, Huntington Beach, Orange County Register report from November. Brianna Rubin and her dog Lexi stopped and got out of the car in front of her house. The dog sat down at her feet. A coyote ran up and snatched it and was gone before she could even realize what was happening. The police chief in Huntington Beach in the newspaper article said, well, we only had 37 pet incidents in all of 2014. We have 78 already. That was in November of 2015. It's a growing problem in some places, and sometimes there's no easy way to prevent that. Alexander and Quinn, in one of their articles, said 20% of pet owners report symptoms of PTSD when they've lost their pets to coyotes. It raises some important management implications surrounding the response or handling of pet incidents. And humans now view pets as family members. The significance is sometimes the same as the loss of a child to some individuals. As a result, a response by agencies should reflect a level of concern for these losses and address the issue with appropriate regard. If you've seen the news recently, there's some people in San Diego that invented some pet armor. This is called a coyote vest, Kevlar. They have spiked collars as add-ons. If you look at a dog like that, if you see one of those in the neighborhood, it's not because the people have seen too many Mad Max movies. It's because they bought one of these coyote vests with the zapper attached to it. And so that's what you're seeing. And the other clue is if you walk around the neighborhood and everybody's carrying baseball bats and golf clubs when they walk their dogs, you know there's a coyote problem there. Thank you for your time. I look forward to the discussion we're going to have throughout the day.